It was a hot August afternoon in 1986 when 70-year-old Joseph Romano drove his old Ford pickup into Albany. He wasn't going far, just a quick trip to the farmer's market for bread and vegetables. Neighbors saw him leave. Vendors remembered him walking through the stalls, quiet, polite, routine. By 5 o'clock, his truck was found abandoned in the parking lot. The driver's door was open. The groceries were still on the seat. His wallet was empty. Joseph was gone. There were no signs of a fight, no trail to follow. One witness thought they saw him talking with two men near the lot, but couldn't give a clear description. Another remembered a blue truck idling nearby. The case immediately stalled. Reporters called it a vanishing. Detectives leaned on rumors. Suspicion fell on the people closest to him: a neighbor who argued over land boundaries, a cattle dealer who might have been owed money, even a nephew with a reputation for gambling. Their names were printed, their lives dragged through years of suspicion, but nothing tied them to Joseph's disappearance. For the Romano family, silence settled in. For the town, the story turned into a whisper about debts and feuds. For the police, the file slid into the cold case cabinet. Years passed, and Joseph remained missing, his truck the only trace. But 6 years later, one retired detective reopened the file. He noticed something everyone else had dismissed: a single witness statement, buried in the paperwork, describing Joseph walking toward two men tampering with license plates. It was the piece that shifted the case and revealed the truth. Joseph hadn't vanished because of family grudges or money disputes. He had stumbled into a crew of thieves, and they made sure he never came back. This is the story of the upstate farm mystery. A man disappears in daylight. 3 suspects suffer for years, and a forgotten testimony finally exposes what really happened. Stay with us as we go step by step into the investigation, the false trails, and the breakthrough that solved one of Albany's most haunting mysteries. If you want to see more cases like this, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Who would you have suspected back in 1986? On Sunday, August 17, 1986, the small farming communities of Albany County moved at their usual. At around 3:30, a neighbor saw the truck rumble down the dirt lane leading from his property. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Joseph drove the same way every weekend. The trip was short, less than 20 minutes to Albany's main farmers market. By 4:20, vendors remembered him walking through the stalls. Several sellers recalled him buying bread and fresh produce. They described him as calm, friendly, moving slowly with a paper bag in hand. To everyone who saw him, it looked like another Sunday for a retired farmer who still enjoyed the rhythm of the market. But within an hour, everything changed. Around 5 o'clock, a parking lot attendant noticed Joseph's Ford pickup sitting at the far edge of the lot. The driver's side door was cracked open. At first, nothing seemed strange. People often left windows down or doors ajar in the summer heat. But when the attendant walked closer, details stood out. On the passenger seat sat a small bag of groceries, bread still wrapped, vegetables fresh and untouched. Joseph's wallet was inside, the cash gone, but identification and personal papers left behind. His keys were missing. There were no signs of a fight, no blood, no scuff marks on the ground. The vehicle looked abandoned, yet nothing about it made sense. Investigators later learned that a woman passing through the lot thought she saw Joseph talking to two men. She could not remember faces, only that they looked ordinary, dressed in shirts and slacks, nothing that stood out. Another driver said he noticed a blue truck parked near Joseph's pickup, but he didn't catch the license plate. Both accounts were vague and unhelpful. No one heard shouting, no one heard a struggle. In a crowded Sunday market, a man simply disappeared without drawing attention. When evening came and Joseph had not returned, his absence was noticed quickly. He was a man of routine, known to be home by sunset. Neighbors checked the driveway. The truck wasn't there. They called his house phone, but there was no answer. By 7:30, they contacted the Albany County Sheriff's Office. Officers arrived, confirmed the truck was still in the market lot, and began their first search. Dogs were brought to the scene. They traced his scent from the pickup across the lot but lost. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, but the accounts conflicted. Some swore they saw him after 4:30. Others insisted he was gone before 5. The lack of cameras in 1986 meant there was no footage to review. The investigation hit a wall almost immediately. What remained was a truck with missing keys, an empty wallet, and a gap of only 30 minutes in which Joseph Romano seemed to evaporate. The case began as a routine missing person call, but by the end of that week, it became something darker. Police could not say if Joseph had been taken, robbed, or killed. Family and neighbors could only wait. The community of Albany was left with a chilling fact. In the middle of a busy Sunday, one of their own had disappeared, and no one could explain how. Joseph Romano was born in 1916, the son of Italian immigrants who came to New York in the early years of the century. He grew up working the land, tending to cows and fields before most boys his age had learned to drive a plow. Hard work was his life from the beginning. With his wife, he built a modest dairy farm in Albany County. For decades, their milk supplied local schools and diners. The farm was not big, but it was steady. People in the community knew the Romano name, and they respected it. By 1986, Joseph was 70. His wife had died 4 years earlier, leaving him to run what was left of the farm alone. He had sold most of the herd, keeping only a few animals and a strip of land. He no longer worked the long hours of his youth. Instead, he lived off savings, a small pension, and what he grew for himself. His life had slowed, but he remained independent. He still drove his old brown and silver Ford pickup, still cooked simple meals, still worked his garden, and still tended chickens behind the house. His routine was simple and predictable. Every weekend, Joseph drove into Albany to visit the farmer's market. He bought bread, vegetables, sometimes meat. Vendors recognized him easily. He was polite, though some described him as firm when it came to business. He carried cash. Always cash. He didn't trust banks, and people knew it. Joseph was not a recluse. He attended church every Sunday morning, where he sat in the same pew he had shared with his wife. Neighbors remembered him as generous in small ways, bringing over eggs, sharing vegetables, sometimes lending tools. He wasn't known for loud arguments or wild behavior. Still, tensions existed. A younger neighbor had argued with him more than once about the boundaries of their fields. The disputes were loud enough that others recalled hearing them. At the market, a cattle dealer claimed Joseph still owed him several $1,000s for livestock. Joseph insisted the debt had been settled. The disagreement left its mark, and people remembered the bitterness in their conversations. Family ties were thin. Joseph and his wife had no children of their own. His closest relatives were nephews and cousins who visited occasionally. One nephew in particular, Anthony Romano, had stayed with him briefly in 1985. Anthony was 28, with a reputation for drinking, gambling, and reckless spending. His stay ended abruptly after disagreements, and he left the farm. Some in the family thought Anthony might have been after money. Others said Joseph simply couldn't tolerate the young man's habits. Whatever the reason, the relationship was strained when Joseph vanished. Physically, Joseph was in good shape for his age. He had no major illnesses, no memory problems, and no trouble driving. People described him as medium build, with a head of white hair and a slow but steady walk. He was not the kind of man who would wander off confused. He was reliable, predictable. He always came home at the end of the day. That reliability made his disappearance impossible to ignore. Everyone who knew Joseph agreed on one thing: he would never leave on his own. He was tied to his home, his habits, and his small circle of acquaintances. For investigators, that certainty shaped the first theories. If Joseph had not chosen to vanish, then someone else had made him vanish. Looking back, Joseph's life presented two faces. On the surface, he was a quiet widower, living out his later years in peace. Beneath that, on the night of August 17, 1986, Joseph Romano was officially reported missing. By 7:30, his neighbors had called the Albany County Sheriff's Office. Within an hour, 2 patrol cars arrived at the farmer's market where Joseph's pickup still sat in the far corner of the lot. The vehicle was sealed off and towed to headquarters for forensic examination. Officers quickly understood this was not a case of an old man simply wandering off. Something else had happened here. Inside the truck, investigators found a paper bag filled with fresh bread and vegetables. His wallet was there, but the cash had been removed. Identification and personal papers were untouched. The driver's door was slightly ajar. The keys were missing. The windows were intact, and there was no sign of forced entry. It looked as if Joseph had parked, returned with his groceries, and then vanished before he had a chance to drive away. At first glance, there were no clear signs of violence. No blood, no broken glass, no overturned groceries. The dirt and gravel around the truck were covered with hundreds of footprints from market traffic, making it impossible to isolate any pattern. Officers noted that the lack of disturbance weighted the vehicle did not rule out foul play. Whoever had confronted Joseph could have done so quickly, with little noise, before he made it back into the driver's seat. That night, police established a search perimeter within a 10-mile radius of the market. Roads leading toward town and the nearby exit to Interstate 87 were patrolled. Gas stations, diners, and rest stops along the highway were contacted. Nothing came back. To strengthen the search, K-9 units were deployed. The dogs traced Joseph's scent from the truck across the lot, but the trail ended abruptly at the edge of the pavement. It was as if he had been lifted off the ground or forced into another vehicle. But the search effort faced an unexpected setback. A sudden summer storm rolled into Albany just after midnight. Heavy rain swept through the county, flooding ditches and washing away scents and traces in the dirt. For hours, visibility dropped and roads turned slick. The storm delayed ground teams and weakened whatever trail the dogs might have followed. By dawn, valuable time had been lost. What might have been found in those first hours was erased by the weather. The conditions in 1986 made the investigation even harder. There were no security cameras in the market lot. Police had nothing to review, no video to reconstruct Joseph's last steps. Every lead depended on human memory. Officers canvassed the market, interviewing dozens of shoppers and vendors. The accounts varied wildly. Some swore they saw Joseph leave around 4:20, bag in hand, heading toward his truck. Others thought he was still inside, later. A woman said she saw him speaking with 2 men near his pickup. She couldn't describe their faces, only that they wore light shirts and looked unremarkable. Another driver mentioned a blue truck parked near Joseph's Ford, leaving in a hurry. He remembered no license plate, no details beyond the color. None of these statements aligned cleanly. Some placed Joseph alive at a time others believed he was already gone. The conflicting memories only added confusion. In the crowded market, with hundreds of people moving through the lot, his disappearance blended into the noise of the day. Detectives considered possible scenarios. Robbery seemed likely. Joseph was known to carry cash, and his wallet confirmed that money had been taken. Yet if it was a simple robbery, why leave the truck, the groceries, and his identification untouched? Another theory suggested personal conflict. Joseph had argued with neighbors and a cattle dealer, and he had family disputes. But no evidence tied them directly to the scene. The final possibility, that he had walked away on his own, was quickly dismissed. Joseph was healthy, reliable, and not the type to abandon his life without warning. By the morning of August 18th, the press had the story. For 3 weeks, Albany County deputies worked non-stop. They questioned more than 30 witnesses. They checked every tip and followed every rumor. They searched barns, sheds, and fields. Nothing pointed to Joseph. The forensic sweep of the truck found no useful fingerprints beyond Joseph's own. No fibers, no tools, no blood. Even his eyeglasses and wallet were still inside, reinforcing the idea that someone had intercepted him in that small window of time between leaving the market and getting behind the wheel. As days passed without results, the case began to cool. Investigators had little more than vague witness statements and the suspicion that Joseph had been targeted. No body, no suspect, no evidence to anchor the file. By September, the official report classified the disappearance as suspicious circumstances with likely criminal involvement. The first phase of the investigation ended in frustration. The storm on the night of his disappearance had erased tracks and scent trails. The absence of cameras left detectives blind. Witnesses contradicted each other. Every path led to a dead end. By the close of the summer of 1986, the mystery of Joseph Romano had become one of the most baffling cases Albany County had ever seen. The first name that surfaced in the investigation was Joseph Romano's neighbor. He was 32 years old in 1986, a young farmer who lived on the adjoining property. He raised a few cattle, planted corn, and tried to keep his land afloat during hard years. He was known to have a temper, and most importantly, he had history with Joseph. For years, the two men had clashed over the boundary line between their properties. It wasn't a massive dispute. It was about a strip of pasture, a fence post, and access to a shared irrigation ditch. But in farming communities, small disputes don't stay small. They simmer. And when both sides refuse to back down, they grow into grudges. Neighbors recalled at least 2 heated arguments in the months before Joseph disappeared. Shouting across fences. One confrontation in front of others, where the younger man accused Joseph of stealing land and refusing to negotiate. Joseph, set in his ways, told him to take the matter to court if he had a problem. The tension was no. Within 2 days of the disappearance, Albany County deputies questioned him. They wanted to know where he had been between 3 and 6 in the afternoon on August 17th. His answer was vague. He said he had been at home, fixing his cattle shed and working on fence posts. His wife confirmed she had seen him outside, but she could not give exact times. One moment she said he was feeding cattle. Another moment she said he was hammering posts. The stories did not line up. To investigators, it looked shaky. To the public, it looked like a lie. The press picked it up fast. Local papers ran headlines like, "Farm Feud Murder." They described the long-standing land dispute. They reminded readers about his temper and his bar fight. Soon, he was painted as the man most likely to have snapped. Neighbors kept their distance. People avoided his stand at the market. At community events, his family was met with stares and whispers. His children were teased at school. His wife refused to go out in public without facing questions. Suspicion was as damaging as a conviction. Police pressure followed. Investigators searched his property, barns, and vehicles. They were looking for blood, fibers, or any sign of Joseph. They found nothing. No weapon, no clothing, no wallet. No trace of a 70-year-old man dragged across fields or into a shed. Dogs were brought in, but they detected no scent of Joseph beyond his own land. Deputies compared tire tracks from his pickup truck with marks near the market. They did not match. Forensics at the time were limited, but even with what they had, there was no connection. Despite that, he remained the #1 suspect. Investigators knew the motive, anger over land. They knew the opportunity, a missing alibi in a crucial time frame. They knew the history, heated fights witnessed by others. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. The case lacked the one thing prosecutors needed: physical evidence. Weeks stretched into months, and the pressure mounted. At town meetings, people asked openly if police were protecting him. Talk at diners and bars circled around the feud. Over time, detectives revisited him again and again. Each interview brought the same result: vague answers, a weak alibi, no new information. Investigators documented everything. The official file marked him as suspect #1. But privately, many officers admitted the case didn't hold. They needed more than hearsay, and they didn't have it. Still, the cloud hung over him. When reporters came back for anniversary stories, his name was always mentioned: the missing farmer's angry neighbor. People pointed to him as if the verdict had already been decided. His children grew up under the weight of gossip. His wife carried the stigma of being married to the killer no one could prove. The truth, however, was that nothing tied him to Joseph Romano's disappearance. No witness placed him at the farmer's market that afternoon. No blood or fibers connected Joseph to his land. No signs of struggle were found on his property. The story had all the right elements: motive, opportunity, reputation, but lacked the anchor of evidence. For law enforcement, this was the first dead end. They had followed the most obvious trail. They had built a case on anger and history. But when the evidence failed to materialize, the trail collapsed. That left them with nothing solid. And yet, the damage to the man's life was permanent. By the close of 1986, the neighbor was still on the list of suspects. But the case against him had stalled. Detectives could not move forward, but the community would not let go. In Albany County, his name became shorthand for the crime. At every mention of Joseph Romano, people added, "That neighbor did it." The irony was that the real answer lay far outside the feud. But in those first months, the spotlight burned only on one man. His story showed how fast suspicion can ruin a life, and how quickly a town can decide guilt before the evidence ever does. Raymond Briggs was 55 years old in the summer of 1986. He had spent most of his life running a cattle stall at the Albany farmers market. He knew every vendor, every customer, and he had done business with Joseph Romano for years. Their relationship was mostly professional. Joseph bought cabs from Briggs, sometimes in cash, sometimes on delayed payments. It was the kind of arrangement common in farming communities. But when Joseph vanished, that old business connection became the seed of suspicion. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. People whispered that Joseph still owed Briggs several $1,000s from a cattle purchase the year before. The whispers grew into headlines. One vendor told police that Briggs had once complained Joseph was slow to pay. Another claimed to have heard Briggs mutter that the old farmer was dragging out his debts. With no clear suspect and a community desperate for answers, the debt story caught fire. And Briggs, once a respected market figure, suddenly became suspect number 2.
Detectives followed the trail into his office. They pulled his books, examined his invoices, and studied every ledger he had kept. It was old-fashioned paperwork, handwritten and bound in thick binders.
The results surprised them. There was no official debt, no outstanding invoice, not a single note that confirmed Joseph owed Briggs money. Briggs himself was adamant. He told investigators that Joseph had paid him in full. He had no quarrel with the man. For him, the talk of debt was nothing but market gossip blown out of proportion. Still, the lack of hard proof didn't stop the pressure. Briggs was summoned for questioning only days after Joseph's disappearance. He gave a straightforward account. On August 17th, he said, he was at the market all day, running his stall. He was busy unloading cattle, dealing with buyers, and filling out receipts. A few vendors backed him up. They remembered seeing him that afternoon, though none could pinpoint the exact time between 4:30 and 5 o'clock, the crucial window when Joseph's pickup truck was found abandoned. That gap in memory left room for doubt. Briggs handed over his transaction sheets, showing who he had sold to that day and how much they paid. He even offered to let police search his farm, his truck, and his storage barns. They took him up on the offer. Teams combed through the cattle pens and equipment sheds. His truck was examined inch by inch. No traces of blood, no signs of Joseph, no foreign objects hidden away. Nothing tied him to the disappearance. But while the investigation produced no evidence, the court of public opinion worked against him. Newspapers were quick to connect the dots. "Debt dispute at the market?" screamed one headline. Another paper speculated that a cattle dealer might have had enough of being cheated and taken matters into his own hands. To readers, it sounded plausible. To Briggs, it was devastating. Business at his stall collapsed. Customers he had served for decades turned away. Some vendors avoided his table entirely, not wanting to be seen speaking to him. He was shunned at church. His children were teased in school, called the offspring of a murderer. Briggs's wife broke down in tears more than once, unable to stand the stairs when she went inside the police files. His section was blunt. Suspect number 2, possible financial motive. It didn't matter that investigators had found no money trail, no witness placing him with Joseph at the crucial hour, and no forensic evidence pointing in his direction. The motive box had been checked, and his name stayed in the folder. For Briggs, every passing week was a reminder of what suspicion could do. Customers who had once trusted him now looked at him with unease. Friends grew distant. His reputation, built over 30 years in Albany's market, was gone in a season. The damage wasn't only financial. It was personal, emotional, lasting. His family endured the weight of the whispers long after the headlines faded. And still, there was nothing concrete. No one had seen Briggs and Joseph argue that day. No one could confirm Briggs ever demanded money from Joseph in the weeks before the disappearance. Every lead the police followed ended in the same place: speculation. Yet, speculation was enough to ruin him. By the end of 1986, the investigation had turned cold. But for Briggs, the coldness wasn't just in the case file. It was in the community around him. He lived under a shadow, walking through town as if wearing a sign that said, "Suspect." When the years rolled on and the case remained unsolved, That shadow never left. Looking back now, it's clear what happened. Briggs was never the man police should have been chasing. He was a victim of circumstance, an easy target because of a rumor, because of a few careless words at the market, because of the natural suspicion that grows when money is involved. His story shows how fragile reputations can be when a case like this explodes. Raymond Briggs never faced charges. He never stood trial. But in the eyes of Albany, for many years, he was a man who might have killed an old farmer over a handful of dollars. It took 6 years, and the eventual breakthrough in 1992, to finally prove he had nothing to do with Joseph Romano's death. By then, the damage had already been done. Anthony Romano was 28 years old in 1986. He was Joseph Romano's nephew, not a son, not an heir by law, but close enough by blood that people expected him to stand by his uncle. Instead, Anthony carried a reputation that cast a long shadow. He was known in Albany County as a drifter with expensive habits and no steady work. He gambled. He drank. He lived off borrowed money and promises he rarely kept. When he stayed with Joseph for a few months in 1985, the arrangement ended in arguments over money, discipline, and responsibility. Joseph was old-fashioned, strict, and frugal. Anthony was restless, careless, and reckless. Neighbors recalled raised voices, slammed doors, and a young man storming off the farm. That background alone was enough to plant suspicion. When Joseph vanished in August 1986, many pointed straight at Anthony. The story was almost too convenient. A struggling nephew waiting for inheritance, maybe impatient to get it early. Police saw motive, the press saw a headline, and the public saw a villain. Anthony's own words didn't help him. On the day Joseph disappeared, Anthony claimed he was at a local bar. He named a few friends. Some confirmed they saw him, others weren't sure of the time. One said it was around 4 o'clock, another swore it was closer to 6. The window between 4:20 and 5:00, the exact time Joseph was last seen alive, remained wide open. The alibi wavered, it sounded soft. Police interrogated Anthony again and again. Each time his story shifted slightly. He was vague about when he arrived at the bar, about who bought the first round, about whether he stepped outside for a smoke. Detectives noted the hesitation, the uncertainty. They wrote in their report, "Alibi questionable, needs verification." The search of his apartment turned up nothing. No blood, no clothing, no wallet, no trace of Joseph. Investigators checked the pickup truck for fingerprints. They found Joseph's as expected, but no match to Anthony. They searched his car, his tools, his trash. Nothing. Still, suspicion clung to him. Reporters circled. Within days, newspapers ran with the story of a greedy nephew and a missing farmer. Headlines asked, "Did greedy nephew kill for money?" The image stuck. It was easy for the public to believe. Anthony drank too much, gambled too much, bragged too much. He lived in debt. He had argued with his uncle. That was enough to make him guilty in the eyes of many. The pressure divided the Romano family. Some defended Anthony, insisting he was flawed but not a killer. Others whispered that he could have snapped, that money drove him, that he had always resented Joseph's authority. Family gatherings grew tense. Lines were drawn. Silence replaced conversation. For Anthony, life collapsed. Potential employers stayed away, old friends drifted off. Even when police admitted they had no physical evidence, the damage was already done. He became the face of suspicion in Albany County, a man everyone looked at twice. The first question always the same. Did you kill your uncle? Cops kept him in the file. Suspect number 3, possible financial motive. That line alone was enough to poison his name for years. He wasn't arrested, but he wasn't free either. The cloud followed him everywhere. Anthony himself did little to help his case. Under stress, he leaned harder into old habits, more bars, more cards, more reckless debts. He lost jobs, lost apartments, and slipped deeper into the kind of trouble that only reinforced the public's belief that he was guilty. Look at him, people said. A man like that could kill for money. The press never let it go. Every anniversary of Joseph's disappearance brought back the same photographs, the same questions, the same names. The neighbor, the cattle dealer, the nephew. Each year, Anthony's picture of the suspicion didn't fade. As the years dragged on, the case grew cold, but Anthony's name remained hot. Every rumor circled back to him. Every theory pointed his way. For Albany, the mystery had a simple answer. The nephew killed the farmer. That belief hardened with time, even as the evidence refused to appear. The real tragedy was that Joseph Romano's disappearance became Anthony Romano's life sentence. Not in a courtroom, not in prison, but in the quiet exile of social suspicion. For 6 years he lived under that weight, knowing that no matter what he said or did, people believed he had blood on his hands. Only in 1992, when investigators finally uncovered the truth about the stolen truck ring, did Anthony's name begin to clear. But by then, the damage had been done. His 20s and 30s had been spent as an accused man without a charge, a suspect without a trial, a nephew who became the face of a murder that never happened at his hands. The Joseph Romano case destroyed Anthony Romano as surely as it destroyed trust in Albany. It showed how suspicion, once planted, can take root and grow, even without evidence. It showed how the wrong person can become a suspect for life, simply because the story makes sense, even when the facts do not. And in the end, that may have been the cruelest twist of all. Joseph Romano was killed by strangers, by criminals no one suspected. And Anthony Romano, his own blood, paid the price in reputation, family, and future, even though he had nothing to do with it. Anthony Romano was never charged, but suspicion clung to him year after year. His name stayed in the files, his face stayed in the headlines, and the community never let him go. The case had stalled, but the damage to his life was permanent. And while the nephew lived under a shadow, investigators had nothing new to offer. The leads dried up, the witnesses moved on, and the story of a missing farmer faded into the background. But the file was marked unsolved. It was boxed, labeled, and stored away in the Albany County Records Office. What had once been a top priority turned into just another cold case gathering dust on a shelf. The lead detective was reassigned to a homicide downtown. His replacement had other cases on his desk. No one wanted to admit it openly, but Joseph Romano's disappearance was no longer an active investigation. For the Romano family, the silence was brutal. Half of them believed Anthony, the nephew, had done it. They pointed to his gambling, his drinking, his sudden departure from Joseph's farm. The other half defended him fiercely, saying suspicion was built only on rumors. The division cut the family apart. They stopped attending gatherings together. Arguments broke out over the dinner table. A once close family fractured, and the man at the center of it, Joseph Romano, wasn't even there to defend himself. In town, the name Romano carried shame. At church, whispers followed the family into pews. At the market, strangers cast glances that were sharp and quick. People didn't say it directly, but everyone had an opinion. The farm feud neighbor, the cattle dealer, or the greedy nephew. Each was painted as the likely killer, and yet none could be proven guilty. The press only made it worse. Every August, near the anniversary of Joseph's disappearance, headlines resurfaced. Unsolved after a year. Farmer still missing. Some articles went further. Did the suspects fool the police? The media's constant focus cemented suspicion. To the public, the case was not just a mystery. It was a failure of law enforcement. Privately, even the police admitted they had nothing. No DNA, no security cameras, no eyewitness strong enough to stand in court. An officer said off record, "All we've got are stories, and stories don't hold up." Some detectives wondered if Joseph might have crossed paths with strangers, maybe robbers or drifters. But the lack of physical evidence crushed every attempt to build a case. Life in Albany shifted because of it. Older residents and women began avoiding the market alone, especially later in the day. The neighbor, already hot-tempered, became isolated. He felt eyes on him whenever he walked into town. Farmers avoided working his landline. Children teased his kids at school. Briggs, the cattle dealer, lost his customers. His once thriving stall at the market turned into an empty space. The debt rumor, never proven, destroyed his livelihood. Anthony Romano carried perhaps the heaviest weight. Within his own family, mistrust ate away at him. Some cousins refused to speak to him. At bars, people muttered that he was a killer who had gotten away with it. Jobs became harder to keep, and debts piled higher. Whether guilty or not, he paid a sentence that never came from a court. By 1991, the Romano case was nearly forgotten beyond those directly tied to it. The town spoke of it like a local ghost story. The farmer who vanished without a trace. A man old enough to be anyone's grandfather, swallowed by a parking lot in daylight. Parents warned their children with his name. But to the wider world, the file was just another cold case among hundreds. Inside the Albany County Records room, the box sat untouched. The early reports, the photographs, the inconsistent witness statements. Everything remained frozen in time. A timeline that ended at 5 p.m. on August 17, 1986, with no answers. For the family, the years did not heal. The absence hardened. Every new Christmas or Easter passed with Joseph missing from the table. The speculation never stopped. Was it Anthony? Was it Briggs? Was it the neighbor? The questions looped endlessly, and the lack of answers meant no closure. By then, even the police who had once worked the case had let go. They admitted quietly they were powerless. "We missed something," one officer reflected years later. But we didn't know what it was. The story of Joseph Romano was no longer just a mystery. It was a wound, left open for years. It reshaped the way Albany saw itself. A community that prided itself on trust and hard work now lived with suspicion and fear. And the truth, that Joseph might have simply crawled.
In 1992, the case was pulled from its dusty shelf. A retired officer revisited the old testimony, a single overlooked detail. A witness had seen Joseph speaking with two men near a truck, tampering with license plates. At the time, the statement was dismissed as irrelevant, but 6 years later, that same detail connected directly to a known gang of truck thieves. The forgotten testimony would breathe life back into the case, and with it, Albany would finally face the truth of what really happened to Joseph Romano. It was the spring of 1992, 6 long years since Joseph Romano vanished from the Albany market. By then, his name had become more of a ghost story than an open case. Families whispered about it at church or the bar. Old newspaper clippings yellowed in filing cabinets. The case was frozen in time, until a retired officer named Walter Green decided to look again. Green had worked the Romano file back in 1986. He had been young, eager, and powerless when the investigation stalled. But something about it had never sat right with him. He remembered the conflicting witness statements, the lack of blood or struggle, and the way suspicion fell too quickly on people close to Joseph. He knew that sometimes the truth was buried, not because it was hidden well, but because investigators had been looking in the wrong direction. In March 1992, Green pulled the Romano file from storage. He spent nights at his kitchen table, flipping through old transcripts. And there it was, a witness statement that had been brushed aside. A vendor at the market had told police that on the afternoon of August 17, 1986, she saw Joseph near two men she didn't recognize. They were crouched at the back of a green pickup truck, working on the license plate. She remembered Joseph walking toward them, maybe to ask what they were doing. After that, he never returned. At the time, this account was dismissed as irrelevant. Investigators had been fixated on debts, land disputes, and family tension. They thought the clue about the truck plate was a distraction. But Green saw something different. He remembered the mid-1980s wave of truck thefts that swept through Albany County. A crew of thieves had been swapping plates in parking lots, driving stolen. He carried the file to the Albany police and argued that the case needed to be reopened. At first, officers were skeptical. The department was busy with fresh crimes. Why chase a ghost 6 years cold? But Green insisted. He pointed to that forgotten witness statement. He highlighted a line in another file. An informant had once blurted during questioning, "We had to take care of an old man at a market. He saw too much." The name Romano was never mentioned, but Green knew it was no coincidence. A special team was assigned to comb through everything again. They retraced the 1986 investigation step by step, but this time with Green's theory in mind. They checked old storage logs, seized evidence from previous truck theft cases, and mapped the crew's known hideouts. One location stood out, a farmstead on the outskirts of Albany that had been used as a chop shop. The property was long abandoned by 1992, left to rot under weeds and collapsing roofs. Investigators searched the farm slowly, methodically. They checked barns, outbuildings, fields. Then, behind the main house, they noticed an old stone well. The ground around it had caved slightly, leaving a hollow smell in the air. Forensics teams descended. They lowered equipment into the shaft. What came back was human remains. Inside the dry well, they found bones, scraps of fabric, and a weathered leather wallet. The wallet still carried identification in the name of Joseph Romano. Dental records confirmed it. The mystery farmer of Albany had been found at last. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. Headlines exploded. "Albany cold case solved after 6 years."
For Joseph's family, the revelation was devastating but clarifying. He had not walked away, and he had not been betrayed by a neighbor, a cattle dealer, or even his own nephew. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, stumbling across men who couldn't afford to let him walk away. Forensic analysis suggested Joseph had been killed quickly. The crew had likely forced him into their truck, driven him to the abandoned farm, and disposed of his body in the well. His cash was taken, his truck left behind, and the scene was staged to look like, but it was too late to undo the damage. Lives had already been broken. Trust had already been shattered. And the real killers? Most of them were already serving time for other crimes. One of the men believed to be directly involved in Joseph's death had died in prison years earlier. Justice would be symbolic, not personal. Albany was left stunned. For 6 years the town had turned inward, tearing itself apart with blame. They had believed the worst of their own neighbors and kin. In reality, the killer had been outsiders, thieves passing through who killed simply to cover a crime. The breakthrough became a lesson for investigators far beyond Albany County. It showed how easily a case could derail when evidence was overlooked, when assumptions hardened too quickly. A single statement, ignored because it didn't fit the theory, had been the key all along. The case of Joseph Romano was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was now a cautionary tale about the danger of tunnel vision, the cost of ignoring witnesses, and the years of pain that follow when justice is delayed. As the well was sealed and Joseph's remains laid to rest, the story of the forgotten farmer found new life, not as a cold case, but as a breakthrough that came too late to deliver full justice. Yet it carried one final truth. No matter how much time passes, one overlooked detail can still change everything. And with that, the stage was set for the final chapter, when the community, the family, and the wrongly accused would confront the aftermath and reckon with what those lost years truly meant.
The final chapter of Joseph Romano's case came in October of 1992. After 6 long years of silence, confusion, and suspicion, the Albany County Sheriff's Office held a press conference. Reporters filled the room. Families of those accused stood in the back, and the Romano relatives waited in quiet tension. The statement was short and devastating. Investigators confirmed that Joseph Romano had been killed on August 17, 1986, not by his neighbor, not by a man he supposedly owed money, not by his own nephew. He had crossed paths with a gang of truck thieves. They silenced him because he saw too much. The headline appeared the next morning in bold print: "Farmer's Death Solved by Overlooked Testimony." For many, it was a shock that the truth had been sitting inside the case file the entire time. A single overlooked witness statement had been the key. For the 3 men who had lived under suspicion, the announcement came too late to erase the damage. The neighbor, just 32 years old in 1986, had spent years being called the hot-headed farmer who might have snapped over a property line. Even after the case was closed, people still looked at him with doubt. His reputation in Albany was scarred beyond repair. Raymond Briggs, the cattle dealer, had carried the weight of whispers about money and debt. His once thriving stall at the market never recovered. Customers walked away. Contracts dried up. By the time his name was cleared, his business was already gone. And Anthony Romano, the nephew, paid the highest personal price. For years he was called greedy, careless, and dangerous. Relatives stopped speaking to him. He lost jobs. He fell deeper into debt. His life unraveled while the community convinced itself he had killed his own uncle. The truth proved him innocent, but it could not restore the years stolen by suspicion.
Abundant itself reeled from the revelation. The idea that outsiders, a roaming gang of thieves, had taken Joseph's life hit harder than any theory of a neighbor feud or family betrayal. People realized they had turned against their own while the real killers were already behind bars for other crimes. Guilt ran deep. Newspapers described the community.
For law enforcement, the Romano file became more than just another closed case. It was a lesson written in failure. Albany police promised to re-examine other unsolved files, to search for missed testimony and discarded leads. The retired officer Walter Green, who had pushed for the review, was hailed as the man who finally brought the truth out. His persistence became part of the department's training, a reminder that a single overlooked statement can matter more than years of speculation. The gang responsible never faced trial specifically for Joseph's death. By 1992, some of its members were already serving long sentences for other crimes. A few had died in prison. Still, investigators were satisfied that the evidence, the statement from 1986, the gang's own pattern of silencing witnesses, the discovery of Joseph's remains in a well on their hideout property, was enough to close the book. The legacy of the case spread beyond Albany. Police academies in New York used it as an example of how bias toward familiar suspects can blind investigators to other possibilities. The Romano file became a cautionary tale. Focus too much on family disputes and money rumors, and you risk missing the real story. Joseph Romano's name was added to lists of solved cold cases, but it carried an unusual note. It had not been DNA, fingerprints, or advanced forensics that broke it open. It was an old-fashioned detail, a witness who noticed a farmer standing near two men switching plates on a green truck. A detail filed away, forgotten, then recovered by someone unwilling to let it stay buried. 6 years after he vanished, Joseph Romano finally had justice. His death had been senseless, his case mishandled, but the truth was known. The neighbor, the cattle dealer, and the nephew were innocent. Albany could stop guessing. Yet the damage was lasting. Families had fractured, businesses had collapsed, a young man's reputation had been destroyed. The community carried the memory of years spent believing in false suspects. And the case left one enduring reminder. Justice can arrive late, but when it does, it forces everyone to face the mistakes made along the way. Joseph Romano's disappearance was no longer an open question. It was history, tragic,